Hello, hello. It's Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we're going to be taking a close look, a deep dive into the most streamed song of all songs that have ever been songs. This is the number one most streamed track on Spotify. It's got close to 4.5 billion streams on Spotify, close to another billion streams on YouTube, and I'm sure all the other platforms. And this is not the oldest track on these streaming services. This track has only been out for about 4 years or so. It is a track by The Weeknd called Blinding Lights. Now, this is actually mixed by a person who is probably the most streamed mixer of all time. If you've ever heard of synth, I've heard different people pronounce his name differently, but I believe that is how the mixer's name is pronounced, synth. It'd be hard to know for sure because I'd love to ask Synth himself. We've had a whole bunch of major producers, engineers, mixers come on this channel. I've got to pick their brains. Haven't done with synth yet because in his past 20 plus years of mixing, maybe probably more than that, he's done like 2 interviews pretty much ever. And there's not a lot of detail in them. We are going to take, though, a very ears first, analytical, listening approach to this stuff. Rather than being able to open up stems and look at exactly what happened in the track, we're going to do something I think is even more instructive. I've got my Pro Tools screen over here, and we'll open it up, and you'll get a sense for exactly what's going on in this mix by listening through it with me, kind of moment by moment, and we'll get a sense for what are the most important elements in each section, how are things being handled in the mix, what are the loudest elements, the background elements, what is the use of effect here, and what can we learn from this, the most popular song and the most popular mix ever, and a mix from one of the most popular mixers in history. A couple of quick notes here. This does not necessarily sound like synth's other mixes. He always sounds like the style of the song that he's working on. I mean, if you go through his catalog, there's no defined synth sound, and I think this is no different. This track has a lot of interesting stuff going on in it as far as the width goes, how they're getting width, the frequency spectrum, which parts of the mid-range are underemphasized. There's some really unique things happening here. And even if you don't love this song or love this music, we can at least determine, right, that the mix here did not get in the way of this becoming arguably the biggest song in the history of people listening to music on demand. So a lot to learn here. Before we dive into it, the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. The biggest and most important sponsor, as always, is you. How do you sponsor this podcast? Check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. If you haven't taken any of them, Mixing Breakthroughs is a place to start. It will give you a whole complete system for mixing. It really absolutely changes people's lives. The way that people mix, the feedback that I've gotten on these over the years. I mean, I am totally happy shilling for my own products because the emails I get from people and the before and afters I get to hear just make me realize this is probably the most useful thing that I've ever done in my life. So I want to get into your hands. Check it out risk-free for 30 days over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. If you're really interested in learning compression or EQ inside and out, really developing your ability not only to use but to hear those tools, check out Compression Breakthroughs and EQ Breakthroughs. Last but not least, a quick shout out to this week's branded sponsors. Soundtoys sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe, and it's very likely that some Soundtoys plugins were used on this mix. I wouldn't be surprised. Synth is an all-in-the-box kind of guy, as is Ilangelo, who produced and mixed a lot of the other stuff on this track. On this album, I should say. Last quick thing is we're giving away a microphone. If you want, you can go over to sonicscoop.com/contest. That's sonicscoop.com/contest, and you can enter to win this very microphone. This is a JZ Amethyst, and we are giving one away to one lucky winner. So don't delay, go over to sonicscoop.com/contest. We give away like $100,000 worth of free gear at least every year, it seems. And right now we're giving away this microphone valued at well more than $1,000. I think it's one of the cooler, vibier sounding large diaphragm condenser microphones out there today and is both affordable and has a ton of character. All right, without any further ado, let's get right into it. Checking out this track by The Weeknd. Right before I play it, we're going to get listening now, but the one quick note I want to give you before we play this track and analyze it together is I have this idea that I think is extremely useful for you, and that is the idea of there being tiers in a mix. I believe that there are 3 tiers in every mix. You've got your tier A instruments. There's only 1 or 2 of these elements, the most important things in the mix, the focal point for that moment in the song. And when you're listening to this with me, in the intro, in the verse, in the chorus, try to figure out what are the focal points for you. What are the number 1 or 2 tier A, priority number 1 instruments? And then after that, what are the main supporting instruments? There's usually 1 or 2 of those that are maybe in tier B. And then there's tier C, which is everything else, the stuff that is supposed to add flavor and intrigue without getting in the way of the rest. But if you're having trouble hearing some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about, that's the first thing to focus on. Decide for yourself what is A priority, B priority, and C priority in this mix. Here we go. Blinding Lights from The Weeknd, produced by, written by Max Martin and one of his collaborators, mixed by Synth. Here we go. And we'll stop right there for now and analyze the whole song up into this first big change here. But what are some of the tier A elements for you? Usually I analyze these by first going in and trying to tell you what I think are the priorities in the mix and what are some of the most interesting and unusual uses of effects or instrument priority. But right now, I kind of listen to this mix as a whole. And from a mastering perspective, a tonal balance perspective, it is different than a lot of other records. And it's actually different than a lot of other songs on this particular record. You can actually see it on the frequency analyzer if you look closely enough. There's this dip that's going on here somewhere between this 800 to 1.5K region, what I call the center mids, where we are scooped in this mix in a different place than you find scooping in a lot of other records. This is a sound to me that's, I consider glassy or cool or cold when there's this dip in the center mids. It gives things this certain kind of cleanliness and shimmer. And I would say that one of the biggest mistakes that beginning mixers make who are working the very first productions is their mixes are often a little bit dark compared to where mixes want to end up. And this mix, if you ask me, is a fairly bright sounding mix. It has some of this brightness and presence that you'd expect out of 1980s era records. Like if you listen to Tears for Fears or Aha or some bands like that, where there's maybe something in common, they often have this kind of upper mid-range presence and this really clean sound, this little bit of scoop in the center mids. And we have that going on here, but with modern low end. So from an overall mastering perspective, I'm almost doing a frequency spectrum analysis for you first, is this record is, one, surprisingly wide and surprisingly wide in the low end. I want you to listen for that on our next pass through. It'll become even more apparent as we get into the next sections that the bass becomes super wide. It starts off fairly centered bass, but the bass gets wider as it goes along. And this is supposedly a no-no, something you're not supposed to do on mixes. But I've got to tell you, in the past, I've been mastering for more than a decade now, and every year that I master it, it becomes more and more common that people are giving me additional width in the low end. You hear it on records from other very contemporary popular artists, like some Billie Eilish records. You hear it on that kind of stuff where there's more and more low end information and low end width than there used to be decades ago. This is a mix that is very controlled in the mid-range. There's definitely some scooping in those common areas for a mastering engineer or a mixer to scoop in, that 200 to 500 lower mid-range area that really kind of cleans things up. But there's also this dip in that center mids area. So that's another big thing I'm hearing. This mix is also wide. It's wide in unusual ways. One, there'll be wide bass elements coming in as we go along. But two, there's another aspect to width, and that is the aspect of movement that we'll talk about in just a minute. Here it is in the intro again. The last cue I want to give you here is once things drop, the snare and the vocal are pretty prominent in this first section, but also listen to our kind of 808-ish bass sound in here. Not our kick, but our bass. There's a lot of saturation and distortion on those things. That thing. So those are some of my listening notes. Let's hear it from the end of this intro going right into the beginning of where the song really drops. So here in this section, we'll revisit this tease of the chorus, but in this first verse, here our bass is fairly mono, and that's one of the things that's going to make the bass sound more stereo later. We get a hint of the stereo bass happening here in this first kind of tease of the chorus, but here in this verse, we have this centered and somewhat distorted 808 bass. It's a really saturated bass sound, and it takes a backseat to the kick. I would say in our first verse, the primary elements here are probably vocal and snare. And it's almost like our supporting elements are kick and the vocal effect. The vocal effects on this thing are big and huge. And as we go on, I want to give you a sense for what they're doing in this mix to allow them to get away with so much reverb on the vocal. Because one of the big amateur mistakes is too much vocal reverb and vocal reverbs that are too bright, too overly apparent. This vocal reverb is very apparent. It's arguably fairly bright in the sense that there's a lot of detail in it, but they're able to get away with it because of a few factors. Some of that's high frequency roll-off, some of it's pre-delay. We'll talk about that more in a second. But listen to this verse section one more time and see if you grab those things. The priority LA elements here really being probably vocal and snare drum, followed maybe by vocal effect and kick. And then this bass that they're not afraid to go dirty on because there's so much other clean stuff happening in this mix. Here's that verse one more time.
My own for long enough. Maybe you can show me how to love. Maybe I'm going through a drought.
Isn't that bass so nasty compared to everything else? It's one of the things that's making everything sound so clean and shimmering is how nasty and gritty and distorted that bass is. Also, guys, let me know how the vocal level is for you. My voice level is compared to the track. So let me know how that's coming through on your end if you need me to either turn myself up or the music down.
You don't even have to do too much. You can turn me on with just a touch, baby. I look around, since city's cold and empty, no one's around to judge me. I can see clearly when you're gone. I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this, you're the one I just,
Cool. So let me know if you heard some of those things. By popular request, I'm going to turn up my vocal microphone a little bit here. Let me know if this is better for you guys here. And let me make sure our stream is still going through. Yes, it is. Great. So you hear it drop in this next section where all of a sudden we go from this kind of mono gritty bass to it's now almost like a synth pad that kind of doubles as a bass, becomes one of our loudest elements. Listen for this transition from that gritty mono bass to now stereo bass happening on the left right.
just a touch, baby. I look around, since city's cold and empty.
some tremendous energy in there. But one of the interesting things that's happening here is they're breaking a few rules that I often advise people on, but they're doing it beautifully. One of the rules that they're breaking here is if you want to get really wide sounding mixes, my general recommendation to you is to not accidentally end up with what I like to refer to as big mono. Sometimes if you're using a bunch of synths or you're using a bunch of guitars on a record and you just layer more and more of the same sound and then you pan that sound out hard left and right, you don't really end up with a stereo feel. You end up with a big mono feel. And this record is kind of breaks that rule, but does it properly, because the two main things that are happening here are there's this really low synth in the chorus that kind of doubles the most prominent parts of the bass line that's super wide. And then once this vocal ends, there's this sawtooth lead, this synth lead that kind of replaces the vocal that's also super wide. So we have at least these two elements that are super duper wide sounding, and there's just like a hole in the middle of the mix. And the whole thing pulls out to the sides. What I often recommend to people is if you want things to sound wide, take contrasting elements and pan them left and right. So rather than having, an exact guitar double or an exact synth double and pan that out left and right where you just end up with swimmy sounding big mono, what if you had two contrasting parts, two guitars playing slightly different parts and slightly different tones left and right? Man, if you have just those two different guitars panned wide and everything else in the center, your whole mix will sound hugely wide. Same thing if you have two juxtaposed synthesizers, two slightly different parts on either side. That will really pull your ears outwards and make the whole thing sound wide, even if everything else is centered, even if you have mono drums in the mix. But here they're kind of breaking that common piece of advice I give. And the way that they're able to stretch this thing out, well, it's twofold. One, there's such EQing going on here that there's really no unnecessary bottom end in our really high wide synth that'll come in a second. And there's really no cluttered up mid-range in this super low synth that's wide. Also, one of the things that's going on here is there's movement between the sides. It's not just one part double tracked with two different takes. We're getting one sound that kind of moves back and forth in the left and right. I know that one of the producers who works with The Weeknd, Ilangelo, I saw a video where he was talking about really liking to use the Waves Mondo mod on like practically everything. And this is one of those tools that has like three different modulators at once, right? It modulates level, kind of tremolo. It modulates, potentially can modulate pitch, and it can also modulate left and right, back and forth. And that's the kind of feel that I'm getting on these tracks, that we are modulating pitch and maybe a little bit of tremolo on the left to right plane. And that's a big thing that's happening here. Another big thing I want to talk about is the use of effects on this. So we'll get into that in just a second, but let's hear this transition, listening for those kind of things from this chorus into the little instrumental section where our lead synth kind of replaces the vocal as our main melody instrument. Here we go.
I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this, you're the one I just, hey, hey, hey. I'm running out of time.
And you hear how I say that keyboard replaces the vocal as the main melody instrument, but it almost doesn't replace it as being the lead. When we get into this big chorus, I almost feel like just when we're talking about volume level relationship, that neither the vocal nor this lead synth are our tier A element when it comes to sheer level. When it comes to sheer level and volume in the mix, this really wide, slightly buzzy, low, bassy synth part is probably the loudest element in the mix, maybe followed by the snare drum. Now, with that said, our vocal and our high lead synth are still extremely audible, but they're extremely audible because they're very bright compared to all of the surrounding elements. This vocal and this synth, I mean, they have such little in the way of the center mids, and what's really being amped up on the vocal and the synth is kind of the upper mid range. And I got to tell you, different parts of the frequency spectrum go in and out of fashion over the years. Part of what makes this sound 80 is that they're not afraid to push 4 and 5K on this mix. And they're not afraid to suck down the center mids, that area, say from 600 to 1.5K. Recently in pop production, it was really stylish to have a lot of 8K on your mixes and not as much 4 and 5K. And I remember there were certain masters I was working on, like, whoa, these guys are really loading in 8 and 9K. Let me just soften that a little bit and bring back some 4 and 5K. And I remember one time getting from a client, it's like, hey, what happened to all the tons of 8 and 9K we had in things? But that's not how this mix sounds. It's the other way around, where it's more pronounced in the lower part of the upper mids. Particularly this 3, 4, and 5K area, and a little bit less emphasis in that 8, 9, 10K area that's been popular at other periods. So that sounds super nerdy, me talking about different frequencies and, what frequencies are popular when. But it's something that I notice, at least from the mastering perspective. So you can see that on the frequency analyzer when I bring it up here in Ozone, if I can get that back to the front of the screen. But one of the other things that you can notice here, if you listen for it, is what's happening with the vocal effects themselves. The vocal effects are really long. We're using long reverbs here, possibly in the range of 3 and 4 seconds, maybe. It's hard to know for sure in the context of a full mix, but we could have 2, 3, 4-second reverbs on our vocal and our lead synth. But the way that they're able to get away with it is, number one, there's a pre-delay happening that's going to separate the vocal reverb from the vocal. And that's one way that we can get away with more vocal reverb. I believe also something Serban does a lot, and a lot of mixers do quite a bit, is to run their delays into reverbs. So there'll often be quarter note and 8-note delays, and occasionally there's little call outs of a particular word, and then those delays would be fed into reverbs. But an even bigger thing is EQing of reverbs. So many beginning mixers don't lop off enough extreme high frequency and extreme low frequencies on their reverbs and on their delays. And here, Serban is definitely getting rid of a lot of super high frequency on the reverb, but the reverbs still sound bright because these reverbs and delays don't have a ton of low frequency on them either. So generally speaking, I would say that when new mixers for the first time here, you're supposed to get rid of some high frequencies on your reverbs and delays. They'll imagine that they're supposed to get rid of, things above 10K. Nah, that ain't it. That's not enough. You don't need a whole bunch of 7 and 8K, honestly, in a lot of reverbs and delays. And I would be surprised if there's much of any energy above 7 or 8K in these reverbs at all. Exactly how low to cut, it depends. If you want a darker, warmer sounding reverb or delay, you might cut these as low as 3, 4, or 5K. I'm not sure if the cuts on these reverbs are happening quite that low, because they are bright sounding reverbs. Part of the reason they're bright, even if we get rid of a lot of the extreme top end, is that a lot of low end is being taken out of them. I don't know exactly, not hearing the reverb separate from the full mix, but if you wanted to go in this direction, my guess is starting out by, say, cutting everything below 600 and everything above 6K. Start there. Pretty much always, your reverbs and your delays want to be more mid-rangey than you think they want to be. The question is exactly where do they want to be mid-rangey? If we're going for much more of a retro, old school, really smooth sounding effect that's a little bit syrupy and dark and haunting in that kind of way, then maybe you're getting rid of 3 and 4K, and maybe you're allowing frequencies as low as 2 and 300 to stay in your reverbs and delays. But if we want something that's a little bit splashier and a little bit brighter without having all that needless splashy top end, then maybe it's more like 600 to 6K is enough of a region. So think about that kind of thing. Where are you hearing reverbs and delays in your favorite records in the style that you're working in? And start playing around with them. All right, the other thing that I want to check out with you guys here as we're listening is one of my favorite tests to do on a lot of these tracks in our mix feedback series is just to take a high pass and a low pass filter to these and say, how would this thing sound on the radio? Not just like the radio, not like a high-end radio, but like the radio where you're walking through the grocery store and they're piping in music through the mono speakers somewhere in the grocery store, what would it sound like, off of an iPhone? What would it sound like off of some small consumer radio in the next room? Getting a sense for what these things sound like in small devices is really interesting. It can tell us a lot about what the mixer prioritizes and values. In some of the tracks we listened to, like Britney Spears' Toxic, when we did an analysis of her track, the mix barely changed at all. When you took away all the low end below 200 hertz, and when you added the low end below 200 hertz, all of a sudden it sounded like the same mix, just more massive. I don't know if that's going to happen here or not. Let's give it a try. So here it is with a whole bunch of low end cutoff and a little bit of high end cutoff, backing up just a tiny bit.
I can see clearly when you're gone. I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this, you're the one I just,
So yeah, no, actually, the mix does not change that much. Once you take away all this low and I'm rolling off everything below 100 hertz, the relationship of the kick drum to the rest of the record stays pretty much the same. The low stereo synth bass, we start to lose its massiveness, and it no longer feels like the tier A instrument anymore that's potentially dwarfing the other elements. When we get rid of the lows, the biggest thing that changes for me is that the vocal clearly becomes the tier A instrument. So I really feel like we're listening to this record on a big, hi-fi system or in the club, and what's really driving us is this low throbbing bassy synth, and then the vocal is kind of floating around in there, super noticeable but not dominant level wise. And as soon as we take out the lows, that relationship kind of reverses, and it sounds more like a conventional pop mix, and it should translate really well to consumer systems because we still don't lose any detail of the kick drum at all. We don't lose the plot of the bass line, it just becomes less dominant over the rest of the mix, and the vocal all of a sudden goes from arguably tier B to tier A. And that's something that I've been finding in a lot of these great pop mixes, that you listen to them on a big full range system and the vocal is almost secondary to the low end, but then you listen to them on mainstream bass light systems and the vocal is the most prominent thing in a super tasteful way. Listen for that change with me one more time as we switch between low end being there and low end not being there. And then let's check it out with a little bit of a mono listen, if I can put this thing in mono for a minute. Here we go.
I'm running out of time, 'cause I can see the sun light up the sky. So I hit the road in overdrive, baby. Oh, the city's cold and empty. No one's around to judge me. I can see clearly when you're gone. And I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh.
Man, you hear how so much of like the majestic nature of this mix is coming from just how big and wide that low end is. The one problem I'd argue with this mix is it's such a wide sounding stereo mix, not from the perspective of having different sounding instruments panned left and right. It's just stereo from there being a lot of stereo manipulation. There's things going on like probably stereo wideners on this track that it doesn't fold down to mono very well. And when we do put this track in mono, it does lose just about everything except for the kick, snare, and vocal. Now, with that said, the kick, snare, and vocal are the most important elements in any pop mix. And honestly, if you have a really compelling rhythmic pulse and a good vocal performance, it's almost all you need like to make a song listenable. But we do lose some of the things that make this mix work as a mix. We lose some of its personality, a little bit too much of its personality from when we fold it down to mono. This particular mix does not fold down to mono that well. But there's enough pulse there and there's a compelling enough performance that, it's okay enough. So that's one of the potential issues that you run into when you're really going for super wide mixes, which this is. When we listen to it in stereo, for me, the sacrifice that we have when we go so wide like this is we end up with a little bit of a hole in the middle. But that's kind of okay, because that is the 80s tonal aesthetic, is that relative to rock records of the 60s and 70s, when we got to these 80s synth bands, there was a hole in the middle at 500 hertz, 600 hertz, 700 hertz, 1K. And there was a little bit of a hole in the middle in the respect that things were being drawn out to the side in these exploitative ways where they weren't in earlier rock records. So these aspects of it give it the kind of personality that it has, this kind of 80s-ish personality. And just so you can hear what I'm talking about with, where the mid-range accent is on this and just how much they're scooping out mids and how unafraid they are to just be like, mid-range is the enemy in this mix. We're getting rid of everything from like 250 to 1.5K. I'm going to go ahead and boost some of those frequencies and cut some of those frequencies, and tell me if you hear the same kind of things that I'm hearing. So we'll just go through this section and I'll do a boost and a cut, maybe at 800-ish and then maybe at 500-ish, and tell me what you hear.
Drowning in the night. Oh, but I'm like this. You're the one I'm just coming back to let you know. I can never say it on the phone. They'll never let you go. This time, I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep in it till I feel your.
So I think you can get a sense for those things being boosted. You know what I should do? Actually, I should lower this track a little bit, because we end up hitting, I have a little limiter here on safety so I don't blow you guys out. And the boost isn't actually happening to quite the degree I'd like to hear it, because it's being compensated for by the limiter. So let me turn it down by a few dB so I can make a huge boost here, and hopefully you'll hear a more significant change. You hear how this crunchy area is just like almost absent. And when I turn it off, I mean, it's just such a different perspective on the mix. In an ideal world, I'd back off on the gain increase here a little bit so we can hear that a little bit better. Let's try this. Backing up one more time. See, this EQ boost here is what some beginners mixes, a beginner mix might sound a lot like this, with all this additional 3 or 4 dB of energy here from 300 to 1K. Let's hear it with this boost one more time. Here's our before. Do you hear how getting rid of those frequencies that have gone in here and artificially boosted, getting rid of them gives us the impression and tone of this mix? If you want to go in this direction, these are some of the potential enemy frequencies there from a mastering perspective, from a mix bus perspective, from a subgroup perspective. If you want this kind of cool, open, glassy sounding mix, those are some of the areas to look at. I think we've covered the major things that I want to cover on this song. I got started late on the live stream today, so my wife has actually started a piano lesson downstairs for one of our students that she teaches, and I'm not in a soundproof room because I do mastering, so you can probably hear some of the piano in the background. So this is my cue to start winding it down. Also because I'm incredibly long-winded and I can talk nerdily about this stuff for like another hour if you let me. But those are some of my key takeaways. Let me know what you guys thought. Did you hear some of the same things that I did? Some of the things making this mix unique are the way that they're handling the mid-range, which frequencies in the low mids and center mids are cut, which areas in the upper mids are being boosted compared to norms from other eras. That's part of it. The way that we're getting width here from really stereo enhancement effects, I have almost no doubt that there's some stereo widening going on here, like something like the Isotope Stereo Imager or something like the Stereo Width Control on some of the Plugin Alliance plugins. I feel like some of that is being added to this that gives us a little bit of that hole in the middle and a little bit of that exaggerated sense of width. In addition to our two main wide stereo synths having a modulation between left and right. If you listen to that main lead synth that replaces the vocal as the main melody instrument, and if you listen to that main wide bassy synth, there's this left to right warble going on. Something like the Waves Mondo Mod could do that, but you can also achieve similar effects with things like delays, stereo pitch shifters, etc. Also remember to really think about when you're doing reverb and delay. If you want to get away with this much reverb and delay, you have to be really thinking about how limited your reverb and delay want to be from a certain perspective, particularly the frequency perspective. You can't go in there with full bandwidth reverbs and delays and expect to use this much of them and get away with it. You got to get rid of that splashy stuff on top and some of that stuff on bottom as well. Maybe you can accent it a little bit more towards the upper mid-range on a mix like this because they're fairly bright sounding, even though they don't have tons of top end. You don't necessarily have to get rid of all of your upper mid-range, but at least getting rid of the extreme top. Also, for a vocal this bright, it's a very bright vocal sound. There's not much going on in the way of low mids. There's a slightly scooped feel even in the center mids, maybe 800, maybe 1.5K, something like that, being carved out a little bit. It's also a very heavily compressed vocal. It has to be to keep up with all these electronic elements. And when you're doing that, when you're heavily compressing vocals and when you're significantly brightening vocals, don't forget to de-ess. There's definitely de-essing happening here. I know it's one of the, something that's there in every chain for Serban Ganeo. One of the things that at least he's talked about is, having significant de-essing available for the types of processing that he does. Those are really the biggest things that come to mind for me. Also, to get a mix that sounds wide in the way that this sounds wide, there's really only a few elements that are straight down the center. It's kick, it's snare, it's vocals. It's that mono bass that happens in the verses, but then our ears are pulled outwards by everything else. And everything else doesn't have to be a ton of elements. It's effects. It's a main low synth, it's a main high synth. You get just those elements super wide sounding and then add some stereo enhancement, and all of a sudden your whole mix sounds super wide, which this does. So those are my main thoughts on this one. Have a listen to it yourself. Let me know in the comments or the chat what felt like the tier A and tier B and tier C elements to you. And let me know if there's any thoughts you had that I didn't cover. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. If you want to go this deep on your own tracks, that's one of the most valuable things you can do, is first listen to other tracks with this kind of ear, zooming in on how they're handling individual elements in each section. And then go into your tracks and say, how am I handling things? When I listen to this track, I feel how prominent the snare drum is, how prominent the kick drum is relative to the bass during the verses. On my own tracks, am I doing the same thing, or is my snare incredibly buried compared to these? Is my vocal incredibly dark and uncompressed compared to these? This vocal has a little bit of auto-tune on it. It's not used super obviously, but if you're working this style, are you not using a little bit of auto-tune when honestly a little bit of auto-tune is necessary for this kind of vocal texture? So those are things to be listening for in your own work. If you want to go this deep, I do one-on-one coaching calls with people, and I also master records for clients, and we'll give them written feedback if they want it on their masters. But a way you can do that super cheap, if you can't afford my normal rates for doing that stuff, which are, significant enough, let's say, you can become a member of this channel. And for $5 a month, we do a monthly monthly Q&A sessions and quarterly mix feedback sessions that you can get into for just $5 a month. Otherwise, I can help you with this kind of listening on your own tracks relative to your references if you book me for mixing consultation or for mastering records. But really, the best thing I have for you is the courses. I think the most valuable thing I've ever done in my entire life is the course Mixing Breakthroughs, followed only shortly by Compression Breakthroughs and EQ Breakthroughs, which really changed the way people hear and use those effects forever. If you have no idea what I'm saying when I start to throw out some of these frequency numbers, just take the course EQ Breakthroughs and you will hear frequencies as well as me very, very quickly. Much more quickly than you thought possible, because it really comes down to, I think, having the right mental frameworks in your mind. Once you know what to listen for and how to break the frequency spectrum up in your head into at least 7 major bands, once you can do that, identifying the right frequency every time becomes easy. So check that out if you're interested in EQ breakthroughs. If you've been shy about using compression, there's a lot of compression going on in the organic elements in this mix, like vocals. If you're afraid of using enough compression, or enough compression on the mix bus or in mastering to get these kinds of sounds out of your records, then you really need to learn to understand compression better. And you can check out the full-length course, Compression Breakthroughs, that will change the way that you hear and use compression forever for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. But if you don't know which one to start with, just start with Mixing Breakthroughs. It gives you a whole system for mixing. It will change the way that you approach and hear the mix forever for the better, allowing you to get better sounding mixes in less time than ever before. 100% guaranteed, or your money back. Also, get a free microphone. We're giving away one of these microphones. This is the JZ Amethyst, great sounding microphone. I don't know if I had it loud enough for the session, so let me know if my vocal level here is good for you. But the JZ Amethyst is really full-bodied sounding condenser microphone. It is like the Shure SM7B if it were a condenser microphone and had like additional detail. It just has body, it has girth, but it has like a little bit of clarity. And we're giving away one of these for free over at sonicscoop.com/contest. That's sonicscoop.com/contest. Go over to sonicscoop.com, sign up for our newsletter there, or just sign up for the giveaway and we can get you on the newsletter that way. And we'll tell you when we're doing all these giveaways and when more great videos like this one are coming out. Also, last but not least, big shout out and thanks to Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop on the SonicScoop podcast. See you next time.